Okay, so can you hear me, everybody? Yes, good morning. My name is Maria Petropoulou, and today I will be giving the first lecture about neutrino astrophysics. So a few things about me. So I'm an assistant professor at the University of Athens in Greece, and I have an astrophysics background. So I don't come from the astroparticle physics community or the neutrino theory community. So my perspective of these lectures is going to be coming from the point of view of an astrophysicist. So in Athens, I have been the lecturer for courses like Introduction to Astrophysics for bachelor students, High Energy Astrophysics also for bachelor and master students, and I have been doing several physics labs. And what about me? What are the main interests that I have is I focus on non-thermal radiative processes from different astrophysical sources. I'm interested in how particles and cosmic rays accelerate in these environments. And I'm also working on multi-messenger modeling of high energy emitting astrophysical sources. So mostly I work on the modeling of AGN jets, AGN coronae, things that I'm going to describe in my third lecture. And I have been also doing some work in transient astrophysical sources like gamma ray bursts. Unfortunately, I will not have time to cover the gamma ray bursts, but feel free to discuss with me over the coffee breaks or the discussion topics sessions about these things as well. So here's my tentative lecture plan. Because I usually talk a lot, I'm not sure if I'm going to cover everything. I will try to do that. So the first lecture is going to be about the astrophysical origins of neutrinos. It's going to be very introductory. In a sense, we are going to go over the different neutrinos that we encounter from astrophysical sources following the energy scale. So starting from the low energies, MeV scale, the even lower energies are going to be covered by Vivienne, if I'm not mistaken. Then we are going to discuss the more energetic neutrinos coming in the TeV energy to PeV scale, and we are going to just show a couple of things about the EV neutrinos. So this is probably the lecture that most people, the things that I will be talking about, but this is the first, let's say, get to know lecture. And then we are going to dive into more maybe technical things. So in the lecture number 2, tomorrow, we are going to discuss high energy neutrino production from compact astrophysical sources. So we are going to have first an introduction to the theoretical background we need in order to make these kind of calculations. Then I would like to introduce to you what are active galactic nuclei. Probably you know by name, but we are going to say a few more words about the details of these sources. And then we are going to say a few words about what type of numerical codes we use in order to model the electromagnetic and neutrino emission from these types of objects. And in the first lecture, we are going then to dive into a little bit more into the details of the multi-messenger models we use or we introduce to model AGNs and why this is important in the period that we live in. As you may know, two of the potential high energy neutrino emitting sources are AGN. So that's why we are interested in that. These two are TXS and NGC. And in one of the exercises, actually, you are going to use a numerical code just to model the neutrino emission from NGC 1068. So that's going to be, let's say, the overview of the lectures. And feel free to ask me during the lectures about any questions that may arise. So the goals is basically, I had 3 goals when preparing these slides, basically to build some intuition about the origin of astrophysical neutrinos from MeV to EeV scales, then give to you a flavor about what are the necessary physical conditions in astrophysical sources that need to be satisfied in order to have neutrino production in environments like AGN and GRBs, as we said, and then understand maybe how these neutrinos of high energies tie in with the cosmic rays and the gamma rays, the electromagnetic, let's say, the other messenger that we have available in a broader astrophysical context. So let's start with the most basic plot that shows the neutrino number flux on the y-axis versus the energy on the x-axis. And it is quite spectacular to see that across many orders of magnitude in energy, 24 orders of magnitude in energy, we expect to have neutrino production happening. So at very low energies, there are these so-called cosmological neutrinos that I'm not going to cover, but the next speaker will. Then moving to higher energy, and these have not been directly detected yet, but moving to higher energies close to the MeV scale, we have the first source of astrophysical neutrinos, which is our sun. Then we might also have some contributions from supernovae, and I'm going to say a few words, but there are seminar speakers that they are going to cover more about that part. We have at higher energies extending from GeV up to TeV, the so-called atmospheric neutrino background. And then at even higher energies, we have the signal that I'm interested in, the high energy astrophysical neutrino flux that has been detected by IceCube. Moving to higher energies, we have the so-called cosmogenic neutrinos at EeV scales, which is a guarantee signal, but we have not yet observed it. So I'm going to say why this is later on a guarantee signal. So let's start from our sun. But in order to have a sense of how we can detect neutrinos of MeV scales, let's have a look first at the cross-section, how neutrinos interact with matter. So here in this sketch, you can see in the y-axis the cross-section for the neutrino electron scattering in millibarn. Just a reminder that a barn is 10 to the minus 24 centimeters squared. And here is the line. The line shows the cross-section as a function of neutrino energy. Let's see here at the scales that are relevant for the sun, and we are going to see why. So here the cross-section is of the order of 10 to the minus 19, 10 to the minus 18 millibarns. How does this compare with the electron Thomson cross-section, which is the most usual, let's say, cross-section that we use in astrophysics, because the most common interaction in astrophysics is electron-photon scattering. So roughly 10 to the minus 24 centimeters squared is the electron Thomson cross-section. And if you make the transformation to centimeters squared, you see that it is about 10 to the 22 times smaller than the Thomson cross-section. And why is that? Because this interaction is basically happening through the weak force and not the electromagnetic force, which has a much stronger coupling. So this is why neutrino detection has been challenging throughout the years, because the cross-sections are tiny compared to the typical processes that we consider in classical astrophysics. And the question is, how big should be a detector in order to detect, let's say, 1 MeV or 0.1 MeV neutrinos? How big should we make it? So let's go here in the plot and just remember this characteristic electron cross-section at that particular energy range, 1 MeV, or here. And let's think how we can calculate that. So the first thing that we need to consider is to kind of expect how many neutrinos per unit time, per unit area, surface area, we expect at these energies. So if we went back, I don't know why this is not appearing right. If we go back to our first plot that we saw, that shows the number of neutrinos, the number flux as a function of energy, we see that at this 0.1 MeV, we expect about 10 to the 10 neutrinos per centimeter squared per second. Okay, we know the number flux. What else? We knew from the theory that the neutrino electron scattering cross-section is of the order of 10 to the minus 45 centimeters squared. So how can we calculate the number of electrons needed in order to make, let's say, a detection of 1 neutrino per day or 10 neutrinos per day? For that, we have to calculate what is the rate of neutrino detection, so the event rate. So the event rate, simply by looking at the units, is number of targets, so number of electron targets, multiplied by the cross-section of the interaction, multiplied by the number flux of neutrinos. So if you put down the numbers, we have a quantity that has units of number of events per unit time. So if we want to have a rate of detection of 10 neutrinos, let's say, per day, then we would need about 10 to the 31 electrons in our detector. So what type of detectors can we build? Let's assume that we have a detector composed of water. So how many electrons we expect in a water detector? In order to have 1 ton of water contains roughly 3 times 10 to the 29 electrons. So if we plug in these numbers, we can estimate what should be the mass of the water in the detector. And this should be roughly 30 tons. So if you want a higher detection rate, you would build by a factor of 10, you would need a 10 times more massive water detector. And this is a very simple estimate that we can do back of the envelope in order to have an idea of how big the detector should be. It depends, of course, on the target that we use. Okay, but let's go back to the sun. And from the astrophysics point of view, neutrinos played a crucial role in understanding how stars actually work. So in 1938, Bethe was the one that was able to show that the fusion of hydrogen into helium can actually release large amounts of energy that are needed in order to sustain the high luminosity of the sun. So the sun emits about 2 times 10 to the 33 ergs units per second. And this type of luminosity is sustained over a course of billions of years. So we need to have a source of energy that can sustain that high luminosity over this large amount of time. And Bethe was the one that actually first showed this in his paper. And for that reason, he received the Nobel Prize several years later in 1967. But let's have a look first into what is the rate of nuclear interactions and why this is important later on for understanding also neutrino production in the stellar core. So this is a rather complex formula at first, but it is very simple to understand if we look at the different ingredients that appear here. So this is the rate of nuclear interactions of the nucleus of type species I with a type of a nucleus with species X. And this rate is the number of interactions per unit time per unit volume. So how do we calculate this? So if we want to fuse a hydrogen, a proton with a proton in order to start the pp chain, as we are going to say later, what do we need? We need to know what are the number densities of these nuclei in the stellar core. We need to know what is the typical temperature of their distribution, so have a sense of what is the fraction of nuclei that have energies much greater than the typical thermal energy, for example, and also kind of evolve these two quantities with an integral over the energy space of that the nuclei occupy. And here there are two interesting terms. One, the decreasing term, as you can see with energy. So the higher the energy compared to the typical thermal energy of the nuclei in the stellar core, the smaller this factor. And this basically reflects the high energy tail of the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution that we know. So nuclei are having a Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution, and the more energetic they are compared to the typical average energy of the distribution, the less probable is to find them in the stellar core. Now, if we look at this term here, this is an increasing term with energy. And this is a purely quantum mechanical effect that basically reflects the probability that the nuclei have in order to overcome the Coulomb barrier. So in classical physics, if you have two nuclei that are positively charged and they do not have enough energy in order to surpass this Coulomb barrier, they will be pushed away. So fusion might require very, very high kinetic and very, very high thermal energies in order to take place. But this actually can be computed quantum mechanically. And if we know this rate for different nuclei in the stellar core, we can predict how much energy per unit time is going to be released by a nuclear interaction. And this is shown here. So we compute this rate per unit volume. Then we know for every interaction, for every nuclear reaction, what is the energy that is being released by a single interaction. We know what is the total mass density in the stellar core. And if you make this calculation, you end up with the energy released per unit time and per unit mass. So this is the critical parameter, which is very important for the stellar astrophysics and for the stellar evolution. So in this axis, you can see this quantity as a function of temperature. And this is the very important point to keep in mind from all of this discussion, that these rates are very sensitive to the density and the temperature, most importantly. Here you can see the theoretical prediction for the PP chain that we are going to discuss. And here is the theoretical prediction for another type of nuclear reactions taking place in the stellar interior, which is the CNO cycle. I'm not going to discuss a lot about the CNO cycle, but you can see that it is very, very sensitive on the temperature, like temperature to the power of 20. Also, PP is kind of has a strong dependence to the fourth. And let's see why this is important. So, why I talked a little bit about nuclear interactions in the sun, and I gave you just a very quick flavor of how this energy per unit mass and per unit time is computed, but where the neutrinos come into play here. So just to illustrate the two main channels, as we discussed, for energy release in the stellar core is the PP chain and the CNO cycle. So the sun has now a life of roughly 1 billion years. It is living in the main sequence, so it is burning hydrogen into helium at a constant rate. But we kind of believe that the sun releases energy in the stellar core by both channels. Still, we don't really know exactly what is the fraction of energy released, or what is the contribution of the CNO cycle to the total energy released in the stellar core. And neutrino detection might be a key, let's say, observable in that. So it might help us pin down what is this exact fraction. So how are neutrinos being produced? If we look here at the PP chain, you can have the fusion of two protons into deuterium, and from that you can create a neutrino, an electron neutrino. You can follow this most probable channel. You can fuse later the deuterium with another proton. You create helium-3, and you emit a gamma-ray photon of the order of a few MeV. Then you can merge two helium-3 nuclei, and you can form a helium-4, which is the stable nucleus in the solar interior, and also you release two free protons. So from this kind of channel, you see that you create electron neutrinos. But also, if you look all the other colored boxes here, which indicate the steps of these nuclear chains where neutrinos are being produced, these are all electron neutrinos. So let's keep this in mind, because this is really important. Also, another interesting thing to point out is that in some cases, like in this first step of the PP chain, you have the creation of 3 particles. So you don't expect that the neutrino will have a specific energy, but you expect the neutrinos produced from this step to have a continuum spectrum of energies, depending on how much energy goes to the positron and the deuterium. In other cases like this, where you have the beryllium capturing a free electron and you create a lithium, you have basically inverse beta decay, and you have the beta decay, and you have the neutrino released. So you have two particles being produced, and thereby you expect that the produced neutrinos might have a more narrow range of energies, or even be monochromatic. So let's look at the neutrino energy spectrum expected from these types of interactions, like the different steps of the PP chain that is the dominant channel of neutrino and production and energy release in the sun. So the first, for example, step that we discussed that produces these 3 particles upon the fusion of the 2 protons, it produces this type of spectrum in neutrinos, that it is continuum. It has, of course, a high energy cutoff at the maximum possible energy that the neutrino can attain. And also the average energy of these neutrinos is of the order of 0.3 MeV. So they're not very energetic. If you go to this kind of step where the beryllium captures an electron, you can see that the neutrino, which is produced here, this type is produces a monochromatic spectrum here and here. But the other types of steps, like the boron that decays into beryllium, and also you have the production of an electron neutrino, you see that it produces generally more energetic neutrinos with a more extending energy distribution, but at the cost of having a lower number flux. So the PP channel, which produces the highest number flux of neutrinos in the sun, it produces also the less energetic neutrinos. And now, depending on the type of detector that you build, depending on the target material that one uses, you may create an experiment that it is sensitive either on the lower energy part of the neutrino spectrum or the higher energy part of the neutrino spectrum. So probably you know the answer, but what was the first experiment for neutrino detection? Which type of material did it use as a target? Was it water? Was it something else?
Chlorine?
It was chlorine. I mean, the chlorine, as you see, has a high energy threshold for neutrino detection. So with chlorine, people tried to basically probe the less sensitive, let's say, channels of neutrino production in the stellar core. But probably, I don't know exactly the history, but probably chlorine was something easier to make back in the day, or like a detector out of that. We are going to say a few words more about this later. Now, I told you before that the energy release per unit time and per unit gram in the sun strongly depends on the temperature and the density. And here you can see some of the results of the solar models that we have, the most recent results that show the density profile as a function of radius and the temperature profile as a function of radius in the sun. And here we are talking about the very, very inner part, so up to 10% of the total solar radius. So we are looking, these are the density and temperature profiles in this very, very small part of the sun that we call the core, where nuclear burning actually takes place in the sun in its life now. What I would like to draw your attention to is that even these are the standard models that we have available for the stellar core now. You can see there is a discrepancy in density and less in temperature. But back in the day, when people back in the 60s knew about PP change in nuclear production in the sun, the discrepancy in the temperature of the stellar core was much higher, was at a level of a few times, like 2 or 3 difference. And why is this important? Because this might change drastically the number flux of neutrinos you expect from different steps of the nuclear chain.
So in your last slide, you showed the flux basically using which we get this, but in your very first plot, I'm confused that how do we get the average flux in small scale, let's say the growth of approximately 0 scale. So there you have many, many sources, and then you do this nuclear physics to get the flux from the individual star maybe. Then how do we get this kind of profile for a small scales like
here in the smaller, as you move to lower energies, you mean?
Yeah.
So here, what we are talking about nuclear reactions in the central core are only the neutrinos that kind of emerge with energies from 10 to the 5, let's say 10 to the 6 electron volts. The processes that give rise to these so-called solar thermal neutrinos are different, so there are different underlying physics, and the same is true for the even lowest energies. So in order to compile this plot, people take a typical standard model for neutrino production for different types of astrophysical sources, and they produce, this is the, let's say, average flux. We are going to see that this, for example, atmospheric neutrinos and the high energy neutrinos have different production channels. So the physics is very different compared to the MEV neutrinos. Sorry about that. Okay, I was somewhere here. So why are these radial and density and temperature profiles interesting also for neutrino physics? Because here you can calculate theoretically what are the radial profiles for the neutrino production rate based on the different channels of the different steps of the nuclear chains that we discussed. So you see that the PP chain, for example, has a more extended distribution. So here's source distribution versus the radius again. So here is the inner core, here is the center of the star, here is 10% of the radius, and so on. Beryllium-7 and borium-8 have more concentrated profiles, radial profiles. Why do you think this is the case? Because they depend more sensitively on the temperature. For these kind of interactions to occur, higher temperatures are typically needed and higher densities. So this means that the neutrinos produced from these boron-8 and beryllium-7 channels, they happen closer to the center where the temperatures are higher and the densities are higher. Similarly, if you look at the CNO cycle that we didn't discuss, you have for different channels different distributions. Either I'm happy to discuss later, but I don't know now on top of my head why this is double picked. So keep in mind the neutrinos in the stellar core are originating predominantly in regions that may have different physical conditions, different densities and temperatures. So let's go back to the first ever experiment for neutrino detection, which was the Davis experiment that it was running from the 70s until 1994. And this experiment was actually motivated or started by discussions that Davis had with John Bacall. Bacall was a great theoretical physicist who has done a lot of work in making calculations for neutrino predictions also in the stellar core for our sun. And based on his calculations, based on Bacall's calculations, Davis designed this experiment in order to detect for the first time neutrinos from our sun. So the idea was the detection method was radiochemical. Why is that? Because electron neutrinos would interact with chlorine-17. You would have electron generation and then the production of a radioactive nucleus, which is argon-37. So argon-37 would have a decay time of about 35 days, and it would actually decay, and people were searching for the outcomes, the stable outcomes of this decay. So if you knew with how many argon-37 nuclei you started with, and they decayed after a certain period, and you counted again how many nuclei you are left with, then you can estimate what is the neutrino capture rate, let's say, in your experiment. And these are the cumulative results of this experiment in a plot showing the production rate of this argon-37 from the neutrino capture, running from the 70s up until 1994 that the experiment ended. And I mean, these units for me or you might not tell something interesting, but on the right-hand side, you can see on the y-axis the so-called solar neutrino unit, which basically tells us is equal to 10 to the minus 38 interactions per atom per second, which is a tiny, tiny number, but the experiment was huge, as we saw. The target material was huge before. So you can have, after so many years, you can take the average and you find something like 2.5. Okay, 2.5, but what was the theoretical expectation? It was close to 7.98 solar neutrino units by Bacall. So it was about 3 times less. And this initiated the whole discussion of what is wrong with the solar models in our sun. Are we making something wrong in our calculation for the temperature, for example? And as I said before, temperature was not very well known back in the day. There were model predictions that could differ by a factor of 3, which would mean that the number flux of neutrinos you expect might significantly depend on that. So a factor of 3 difference might be okay within the uncertainties of the temperature knowledge back in the day. So they went back and they recalculated their models, and almost for 30 years, this solar missing neutrino problem was indeed a problem. We didn't know if the theory was wrong or if there was something else that we were missing from the neutrino physics side. Just to add also that over the years, then there were other experiments using different materials like gallium, not the chlorine, water. They were detecting neutrinos at a flux which was again lower than the predicted at the level of 60 or 50% roughly. Why was that? The answer basically experimentally, let's say, was addressed early in 2000. So in 2001, the neutrino experiment, which was called Sudbury Neutrino Observatory in Canada, solved the problem. And why solved the problem? Because it was designed in a way to be sensitive not only to electron neutrinos, but also to all 3 flavors of neutrino combined. And here is the result. So this experiment used heavy water instead of regular water. And you can see that the detection, the channel that was able to detect electron neutrinos was similarly giving this 30% roughly solar neutrino units, 0.3 of the predicted one. But when you accounted for all 3 flavors of neutrinos, the predicted rate was rising close to 0.1, so close to the theoretical prediction, which means that indeed we were not missing any neutrinos from the sun, from our models, but the neutrinos that we were detecting on Earth were not simply all electron neutrinos. And remember that the neutrinos produced from these nuclear reaction rates are all electron neutrinos. So basically, here comes the physics of the neutrino oscillations that was, as an idea, was also proposed by Pontecorvo in the late 50s, actually saying that if the neutrinos have, at least one of the neutrinos has non-zero mass, then it is possible that for a neutrino that is born as an electron neutrino to be observed later on after it has propagated over a length scale as a neutrino of a different flavor. And actually, this is something that we can now measure. So there is the Borexino collaboration, the Borexino experiment, for example, that can measure what is the survival probability of electron neutrinos produced in the stellar core, which is pretty amazing. I mean, you can theoretically calculate what is the probability to observe an electron neutrino that has been born as an electron neutrino using the mixing angles between the different states in vacuum and in the presence of dense material. And why this is really important? Because we said that in the stellar core, the densities are very high. And we also know theoretically what is the density profile now in the stellar core. So here are the markers show the measurements with the associated errors, that basically these errors come from the uncertainties that we still have in the solar models. And these uncertainties mostly come because we don't really know exactly what was the initial metallicity with which our sun was born. And here you can see that the PP, the neutrinos produced through the PP channel that have the lowest energy, as we discussed before, have the highest probability, survival probability. But as you move to more energetic neutrinos, which are mostly produced by this channel, the boron 8, and remember, the probability of creating boron 8 neutrinos was peaking at smaller distances from the stellar core, where the densities were higher. So here you see that the vacuum prediction for the mixing would not work well. And actually, you need to account for the presence of dense matter. And actually, this depends on how dense the medium is, the density of electrons that you have. So this is pretty cool that we can do this and test the solar models using experimental data. I will skip the Nobel Prizes, and I will go to the experimental evidence now, the first experimental evidence for electron neutrino detection from the CNO cycle. I said before that the CNO cycle is the other kind of channel for creating helium in the stellar core. It typically requires higher temperatures, but it has a very sensitive dependence on the temperature. And these are the predictions, the spectra, the energy spectra of neutrinos expected from this channel. You can see that are in between the predictions of the PP and the boron, but it's very difficult to detect experimentally. And I'm not an experimentalist, but when I look at this plot, it's basically the number of events in the detector versus the energy. And I see that the CNO neutrinos are given by this line, and all the others are kind of backgrounds to that signal. It's kind of very difficult to say that I can measure the CNO neutrino flux easily. But this is one of the latest results published in 2020, and people are making efforts in order to pin down better estimate the other predictions of neutrinos from the other channels, suppress the backgrounds in order to see in this very sensitive energy range the signal that we expect, and let us know exactly how much the CNO cycle contributes to our sun today. And it's kind of important to think that neutrinos played a key role in order to address all of these things, and our sun is just a very simple, boring star. So in astrophysics, the sun is something, okay, one solar mass star, nothing very interesting happens. There are other more massive stars where the CNO cycle, we think it takes place even when these stars are in the so-called main sequence, the main part of their life. So imagine if we had the ability to detect also neutrinos from these types of stars, which is not possible, but just to get the bigger picture. And this brings me to the life cycle of stars. Our sun is, again, a kind of boring star. In a sense, is going to, after maybe 10 billion years, become a red giant. And then it's going to lose most of its material through very strong winds, and it's going to create this spectacular planetary nebula that you might have seen in pictures. And then it's going to end up like a white dwarf. This is the inner part of the sun, which is going to be composed by carbon and oxygen mostly, and it's going to emit thermally this due to its high temperature, but nothing else happens. However, more massive stars with mass initially greater than 3, roughly, or 5 solar masses, they have a spectacular death usually. So what happens is they also undergo this red supergiant phase, but because they are more massive in their stellar cores, they can create much higher temperatures and densities that are needed in order to fuse other elements. So instead of stopping the fusion to carbon and oxygen, they can fuse this into heavier elements up to iron. So when iron is formed, then something happens, and I will briefly describe, and then you may have a supernova explosion, which is one of the most energetic transient events of a stellar origin in our universe. So here is like a sketch of what would happen in the sun, not in the sun, in a massive star, when all of the inner part is basically composed by iron. Iron is the most stable nucleus in the universe, but also it's kind of interesting to keep in mind that when we have nuclear reactions taking place in a star, these take place in the core and then in cells, concentric cells that have different temperatures and densities. And because of that, as you go out, where the temperatures and density go down, you typically fuse lighter elements. So here the cell is composed by helium, the innermost shell was composed by carbon and oxygen and so on until we get to the iron core. But how much time I have? Because I usually...
I think 1 hour, right? So we started at 1:30, so 20 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when we reach to the point where we have iron nuclei formed, then something interesting happens in the stellar for the star. Why is that? Because it's not possible anymore to fuse two iron nuclei and release energy. This kind of fusion would require energy. So this means that if you lose your source of energy from the stellar core, then you cannot oppose to the gravity. And always, let's say, a star is living when you have a balance between some source of pressure and gravity. So that's the whole idea of stellar evolution, in a sense. So when the star loses its source, which is the nuclear reactions taking place in the inner core, you have the so-called core collapse. So you cannot oppose to the gravity anymore, and the inner part of the core gravitationally collapses. And this kind of collapse lasts about a second, which is again amazing if you think that all of these time scales are huge, are millions or billions of years, depending on the mass of the star. So this inner core typically has 0.5 to 2 solar masses. It's not the whole mass of the star concentrated there, but a pretty big fraction. And then at some point, this core, which is composed by iron nuclei, it collapses and creates the so-called proto-neutron star. During this process, neutrinos are playing a pretty important role, and I'm not going to go too much into the details here because there are seminal speakers who are going to address this, the importance of neutrinos. But just to give you an idea, just to show you the first two steps and why neutrinos are kind of important, and also point out that neutrinos are being produced also when you have this formation of the stellar core. Here is composed by iron. There are also free electrons in there. Remember, I mean, you cannot have simply nuclei. You have free electrons that are a degenerate gas. So in this initial part of the collapse, the electrons are captured by the nuclei, iron nuclei, and they create neutrinos. So these neutrinos at these densities, the initial densities, can escape from the star, from the innermost part. But as the collapse, because here this part of the sketch shows the velocity vectors. So here you have the gravitational collapse indicated. But as the collapse goes on, you have increase of the density, and you can reach here in the innermost parts densities of the order of 10 to the 12 grams per cubic centimeter. And at these densities, neutrinos cannot free stream anymore. So neutrinos are trapped, they diffuse because the diffusion length is much larger than the typical size of this region here. But the outermost neutrinos coming from this part, they still escape. Oh, sorry. Okay, let's see. At some point, as we said, the gravitational collapse continues, and it creates now, it reaches densities of nuclear matter. So now we have, instead of nuclei, we have basically almost free nucleons in this region, 10 to the 14 grams per cubic centimeter. And yeah, without going into the details, at this point, we have changes in the compressibility of this material. So at some point, the collapse that was going on until here, it creates a shock wave that now propagates outwards. And as the shock wave propagates outwards, it deposits energy into the material. So it loses energy because it dissociates the nuclei that are found in there, in this region. And because of the dissociation, you have now, let's say, a sea of free neutrons and protons in these innermost parts of the star. So because of this, I mean, because the shock wave loses its energy as it deposits it into the material, then at some point, it cannot anymore propagate outwards, so it stalls. and then you don't have a supernova explosion. And it has been a big discussion in the supernova community about how this shock that now basically is stagnated, how it can be revived and propagate outward, and basically explode the star. Neutrinos play a crucial role there because they can also revive the shock by depositing their energy there. There are other mechanisms as well, like magnetic fields, very strongly rotating stars, and so on. But neutrinos are crucial, and how they are transported, how you model the transport of neutrinos in these environments is critical in addressing this point. I'm not going to go into the details, and just to say that the only example that we have of a supernova explosion that has been detected in neutrinos is supernova 1987A. This actually was the first extragalactic neutrino source. It was a supernova occurring in the Large Magellanic Cloud at a distance of 51 kiloparsecs from us. Just to give you a sense, our galaxy has a typical radius or diameter of 20 kiloparsecs. So this is the most nearby galaxy. And here is the signal that Camillo-Kante actually detected and some other experiments. The interesting now thing is that the neutrino luminosity, if you convert the events into luminosity, is of the order of 10 to the 52 ergs per second. It has this kind of profile in time. And the maximum neutrino luminosity is of the order of 10 to the 53 ergs per second. And I said, electromagnetically speaking, when we see a supernova, it releases 10 to the 51 ergs per second. This is the magical number of a supernova explosion. Here, neutrinos would carry even more energy. So it's kind of, it's a very important part of the stellar evolution and the stellar explosion. What people or the community is trying to do now is basically to search or to be ready for the next supernova explosion in our galaxy, because this hasn't happened for hundreds of years. And we expect to have, I think, a supernova explosion. I don't remember now the rate, but people expect that within the next century, at least, we should have a supernova explosion in our galaxy. And now we have, the goal would be to look first for the neutrino signal that would arrive, as we see in this old theoretical plot. The neutrino signal, oh, not theoretical, one experimental plot. The neutrino arrival would be here, minus 0.25 days before the peak of the optical emission that we saw from the supernova, the optical light. So the idea is to have the trigger coming from neutrinos, point all our telescopes into the supernova, and try also to understand how the formation of the optical light, how the optical light escapes from the supernova, because this is also related to open questions in radiative transfer we have in these environments. Now, moving to higher energies, just a couple of things. Here, the processes that are related to neutrino production in our atmosphere and in the astrophysics channels that we are seeing here are all related to the so-called cosmic rays. Just a zoom in into this part of the spectrum before we move on, coming from, it's a little bit old, but here you can see the diffuse neutrino flux that IceCube has measured using different samples and different event samples and different times. And this is coming up on top of the so-called atmospheric neutrino spectrum, which is a background for those who do neutrino astrophysics. So far, we didn't have any detections at the range of 10 to the 17, 10 to the 18 electron volts. There were only upper limits until a paper came out by KM3Net collaboration, discussing the detection of the first very energetic neutrino ever, and this is the estimated energy range and flux. More about this later. What are cosmic rays?
Question.
Yeah.
What's the thank you. Can you tell me what's the scale for the cosmogenic? I mean, I think it's smaller than cluster scales, right?
Smaller band clusters.
For example, 2 MPC.
Mm,
Because I'm a cosmologist, and so I'm very care about the scale.
okay. Okay. So when we say cosmogenic in that perspective, what is the scale over which they are produced in the universe, you mean? What is the typical length scale?
Yeah.
So I think if you consider that these are coming from very high energy protons interacting with the CMB photons, I would say that these length scales could be of the order of 10, 30 megaparsecs for the most near, 100 megaparsec for the most nearby universe. But
Okay, thank you.
yes, and what about cosmic rays? Cosmic rays are again nuclei and free protons, basically, that have very high energies. So now, comparing that to the neutrino spectrum that we saw before, this is the energy flux of cosmic ray particles as a function of energy. It ranges from GeV energies, which are cosmic rays like protons coming from our sun again, up to 10 to the 19 or 10 to the 20 electron volts, which are the ultra high energy cosmic rays. Basically, all the cosmic rays that have energies above 1 PeV or something, they can create neutrinos of the order of 1 PeV divided by 20 and above. So all of this part of the cosmic ray spectrum is to some degree responsible for the neutrino production at high energies. So the atmospheric neutrinos in particular, how are they produced? And they are a pretty interesting, let's say, field of research on its own. Atmospheric neutrinos are being produced when these cosmic ray particles, they enter the Earth's atmosphere. So you have a very high energy cosmic ray particle. For now, let's call it a proton, energetic protons. They interact at some height above the Earth's surface with some atoms from our atmosphere. They can create pions. So these are inelastic collisions of protons, energetic protons, with other atoms. For simplicity, take here protons as well. So you have pions, and you have different types now of cascades that are being formed in the atmosphere. You can have the electromagnetic cascades, which are initiated by the decay of neutral pions into gamma ray photons, or photons. Photons can pair create. Some of these pairs might interact via Bremsstrahlung or Compton scattering, and they can create other photons and so on. So this is the part, the electromagnetic cascade part. At the same time, you might also have the creation of charged pions that they will decay eventually into muons that you can either detect using surface detectors. And some of these muons and pions will later on decay into neutrinos, and you can detect them as well. So you have different types of cascades, and it's very important to keep in mind that the picture that we have here for cascade formation in the atmosphere has many similarities with the cascades that I'm going to describe later on in astrophysical sources. So the physics are kind of the same. The target material is different. Instead of having the Earth's atmosphere, we're going to have ionized hydrogen gas, for example, or we are going to have background photon fields instead of that. And the energies, of course, are different. But the idea is the same. And I'm not going to bore you with the details, just to say that this type of equations that one has to solve for the cascade formation in the atmosphere also have similarities with the equations that I'm going to show you today, tomorrow and the day after, about modeling of the astrophysical sources. So just an idea is a simple differential equation that shows how the number, so you want to calculate how the distribution of, let's say, protons or some other particle depends on the depth. X is the depth in the atmosphere. So in order to calculate this gradient is going to depend basically on three main things. The first thing is, let's say that the first two terms are the sinks. So how these particles are being reduced, how you remove particles of that particular species from the atmosphere. And the third term is the source term, how you add particles of that particular species as they propagate in the atmosphere. So the first, for example, term, it says that particles are reduced because of this species I, because they interact with the air, with the atmosphere. So if we know what is the interaction of that interaction, the cross-section of that interaction, we can calculate this characteristic length scale. At the same time, these particles might be lost from the cascade because they decay into another type of particle. So this is the decay length, interaction length and decay length. And then there is the source term that tells us that these type of particles might be generated by other types of particles as they interact with the air. And here you can see, again, this type of term that accounts for the cross-section. So things to keep in mind from this slide is that when we want to calculate, let's say, the number distribution of cosmic ray species or particle species I in the atmosphere at a given depth, we need to know the rate at which this particle species interacts with the air, because this removes particles from the cascade, the rate at which it decays into another particle species, because this also removes particles, and the rate at which this particle species is generated by other particles interacting with the air. And just to give you an idea that using this type of calculations, we can also build analytical approximate models for how the atmospheric neutrino spectrum depends on the so-called zenith angle and the energy of the neutrino. So how do we define here the zenith angle? If you are sitting here and you are looking above you, this is the so-called zenith direction, and theta measures the angle between this direction and the location, for example, of a stellar object. So theta equals 0 means we look up of you, theta equals pi over 2, you look above the horizon. And now you can imagine, for example, that if you have a cascade formed in this kind of direction in the atmosphere, the path length is greater than the path length vertical on top of you. So differences in the path length means that you have more, let's say, material to interact with. So this will affect the interaction rates that we discussed before. Okay, so it is an interplay between how fast the primary particle species will interact or before decaying into a neutrino. And this kind of interplay leads to these types of angular profiles of the neutrino flux. If you're interested, we can discuss more about that. And I will just close with the high energy now neutrino production mechanisms, which are much simpler. They're much simpler compared to what we discussed about nuclear reaction rates, nuclear production channels, and even the collisions with the atmospheric particles in our Earth. High energy neutrino production mechanisms are basically two. They are inelastic PP collisions. You have an energetic proton colliding with a low energy proton, from example, from an ionized hydrogen plasma. And then you have the creation of pions that they will decay, as we saw in the cascade in the atmosphere, into muons and muons into neutrinos. I just want to say here that besides these PP collisions, the maybe most important channel can be peak gamma collisions, peak photopion production, that again, you have inelastic collisions of a photon with a proton producing this type of pions, and then the decay chains. And another very important process that it is often omitted when we talk about neutrino astrophysics, but it is very important when we deal with the modeling of astrophysical sources, is that a photon, if it's not energetic enough, can still interact with a proton in order to produce a lighter particle, here an electron and positron pair. So this is a very important process because you can produce, you can inject into the astrophysical source energetic electrons and positrons instead of energizing them from their rest masses to relativistic energies, as we are going to discuss tomorrow. So these simple two cases are channels are the important for neutrino production, and neutrinos in astrophysical sources, they will be produced as electroneutrinos, muonneutrinos, and their antiparticles. So we don't produce tau neutrinos with these processes. And a few highlights, experimental highlights, and some of them I will discuss them in lecture 2 and 3. So the first ever highlight came into 2013 when the astrophysical neutrino flux was discovered. And when we say astrophysical neutrino flux was discovered, at the time, this was based on 28 events that you can see them here. You knew what the events were, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, with their typical energies above 30 TeV. But if you compare their histogram, so this is histogram of events accumulated over these many days as a function of the energy deposited in the detector, you can see that these events pop up above the predictions of the atmospheric flux of neutrinos, which is always a guaranteed signal. So this was the very first evidence that we have astrophysical sources that can produce energetic neutrinos. The second kind of game-changing, let's say, detection was in 2017, when another energetic neutrino of the order of 300 TeV was detected by IceCube again. But what made this special? It was detected, this is the angular error, like the 90% angular error for that neutrino event on the sky. So here's declination right ascension in degrees. But what made it special is that at the time, there was another astrophysical source that you see here with a green point that was undergoing an electromagnetic flare. So it was exhibiting high flux in all the electromagnetic spectrum. So this was, let's say, a coincidence of a neutrino, not only in space, just looking at the positions on the sky, but also in time. And even though it's not significant for the standards of particle physics or in general, like it's not a 5 sigma detection, it comes with some underlying assumptions, it was very intriguing that actually made the whole community trying to explain this kind of detection and whether we can build physical models for explaining it. So contrary to what we have, for example, in the sun we know what is the theory behind. We have the PP chain, the CNO cycle, and so on, things very well established. In high energy astrophysics and neutrino physics, we don't really know what is the model behind the detection. We know what is the physical process, but not the actual model. And this is the interesting part, let's say, of neutrino astrophysics at high energies. Interestingly, there is another source that came up. This is by looking now time average data over the course of 10 years with IceCube and looking at their position in the sky. By comparing with the locations of some hundreds of astrophysical sources of interest, you can see here that the hottest spot on the neutrino sky is another galaxy that we are going to discuss, NGC 1068. And just to give you an idea, if you take the neutrino spectra, the 10-year average neutrino spectra of NGC 1068 and this other blazar, this other AGN, they are very different, as you can see, in terms of energy, in terms of spectral shape, in terms of luminosities as well. And they also contribute to different, maybe, parts of the diffuse flux. And this is an open question now. How do we make, or how do we build up models in order to compensate for these differences? Are different types of galaxies producing neutrinos with different spectral shapes? And why? Why does one source preferably produce lower energy neutrinos than the other? What are the astrophysical differences of these sources? And also you can later listen to the talk by Federico, who is going to discuss a little bit about this type of sources, hopefully. And another interesting thing is that we have detection of observational evidence of neutrinos coming from our galaxy. And again, this is a guaranteed signal. Why is that? We told before about cosmic rays. These are cosmic charged particles that they propagate between galaxies and in our galaxy. Our galaxy is a spiral galaxy with lots of gas and dust in the spirals. Here is an optical image. We also know the gamma ray emission, or we detect the gamma ray emission from our galactic plane here and from point sources, but mostly from the galactic plane. And gamma rays are produced by what, do you think? In order to explain the signal, the most easy way to explain it, the most physical way, is by PP collisions. So you have the cosmic rays interacting with the gas of our galaxy, producing neutral pions, and the pions decay into gamma rays. So we can make and explain these gamma ray detections. And okay, of course, if you have these PP collisions, you expect to have charged pion production and thereby neutrino production. However, as you can see here, this is the observed neutrino sky map along the galactic plane. This is the expectation of the model. At the moment, we don't have the resolution, let's say, to point out or to understand if the signal that we see is coming from this, it is diffuse, coming from interactions of cosmic rays with the gas, or it is also hiding behind it some of the point sources in our galaxy that we believe accelerate cosmic rays to PeV energies, which are the so-called pevatrons. So it might be there are some pevatron sources hidden, but we cannot tell now whether or not this is the case. And lastly, the single one event, that it is kind of remarkable at energies above 100 and so PeV, the energy flux is above the upper limits, but still consistent. If the source that produces that high energy neutrino is kind of a transient source and not persistent, or if this is not coming from the cosmogenic diffuse background. So I might be saying things now that are kind of not making sense, but you can ask me later about that. This is kind of perplexing, I would say, and interesting. And actually, it's very difficult to explain because we don't really have a good handle of what is the responsible astrophysical source for that. There are many candidate astrophysical sources in the area of the sky where this neutrino came from. This was about that. And the cosmogenic neutrinos that I briefly discussed, cosmogenic neutrinos are being produced, and we call them cosmogenic because they are the outcome of the cosmic ray interactions as they propagate in the intergalactic medium. So you have an astrophysical source, an active galaxy, it accelerates protons. If these are very, very energetic, 10 to the 19, 10 to the 20, basically electron volts and beyond, as they escape and propagate to Earth, they interact with background photon fields and they create neutrinos through the P gamma interactions. So there are many models about this flux because there are many astrophysical uncertainties. Why is that? We don't really know what are the astrophysical sources of the ultra-high energy cosmic rays. We don't know how these are distributed across redshift, across the universe. Different type of population of sources have different evolutionary paths, so their density changes differently with redshift. Yeah, so we don't really know also what is the composition, because composition in the ultra-high energy cosmic ray part plays a role in the neutrino flux that you expect from these interactions. So I will leave you with these key questions. I would say that solar neutrino physics is better understood, but it actually took some time to actually pin down the models for the sun. Now we are entering the era of high energy neutrino astrophysics, where there are many open questions, and hopefully we are going to address some of them in the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, please don't run away.
Okay.
So, yeah, are there any urgent questions at the moment? If not, otherwise we are running a little late. I would suggest, I mean, there's also a discussion session in the evening where we can come back to these topics. Otherwise, I would suggest we have now a coffee break, and we will have the coffee break until 10 past 11 so that we have the half an hour. Okay, thank you very much. Or is this, by the way, okay to leave the fan on, or is this getting too cold? It's a little cold, huh? Okay, I'll put it.
Necessary.
Not necessary. So we are, for those of you on Zoom, we are coming back at 10 past 11 with the next lecture.
Yeah, there's a comment on the right. Yes.
When they start with the highlights of my result analysis, first the not first the diffuse Neutrino diagram, then the XS, and then LGC, and then make a display.